I never imagined I would receive an anonymous letter saying the mother of the other boy wanted to write to me. My name is Diane. I'm 60 years old, and I lost my son Michael in such an unexpected way that I never thought anyone would dare to touch that part of my past, especially not the woman whose son was with mine that night. But she did, and when her words reached me, like dust rising after years of silence, something inside me woke up. I didn't know if it was anger or pain or just longing screaming in a new way. And I didn't know that letter would be the first of many. Together, those letters would begin to stitch together a story no one ever expected to hear. Get ready. Because this isn't just a story about loss. It's about what stays, even after the end. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Stories made to touch the heart, transform memories, and remind us of what truly matters. It was a gray August afternoon when I heard the soft sound of paper being slipped under the door. I was in the kitchen, making coffee I probably wouldn't drink, as I had been doing for months. The sound made me furrow my brow, but I didn't move right away. There was something in that house that held me in suspension, as if every small gesture required crossing an invisible field of pain. When I finally walked to the door and saw the envelope on the floor, my heart beat faster, for no clear reason. It was a simple envelope, brown, without a stamp, no return address, with my name written in rounded, delicate handwriting. I knew before I even opened it that handwriting belonged to a woman. And inside that envelope was something that couldn't be ignored. I sat on the living room chair with the envelope on my lap, as if holding a promise or a weapon. It took me a few minutes to gather the courage to open it. When I finally tore open the side of the paper, I found a handwritten letter. The first line said, "I'm the mother of the other boy." There was no name, no greeting, just that sentence. A chill ran down my spine. I kept reading. The letter was short, contained, but full of visible pain. The woman wrote that she had thought a lot before writing, that she didn't want to be intrusive, but she needed to say that she too had lost something that night. Even though her son was alive, she had become someone else. The letter ended with a sentence that made me slowly lean back in the chair, as if my body had lost its strength. If I had done something different that night, maybe your son would still be alive. The words hung in the air like dust. I closed my eyes. I ran my fingers along the edges of the paper, as if touching it might help me understand. Then I stood up, took a fresh sheet of paper, and sat at the kitchen table. The pen trembled in my fingers, but it wasn't from anger. It was something deeper, as if that letter had stirred a long dormant gear. I wrote without thinking too much, with the quiet fury of someone who's been silent for too long. I didn't ask for explanations. I asked questions. I asked what her son said when it all happened. I asked if he cried. I asked if she knew Michael had been there against his will. I asked if she truly believed writing a letter was enough. When I finished, I didn't reread it. I placed the letter in an envelope and walked to the mailbox at the corner. My steps were steady, but my chest carried a storm. When I dropped the envelope into the metal slot, I felt something different. Not relief, not peace, but movement. As if for the first time in a long while, something inside me had shifted. That night, I didn't sleep. But it wasn't because of sadness. It was because I was waiting, and because of the strange feeling that maybe, just maybe, that letter would be the first of many. The morning sun came in through the slats of the blinds without asking permission. I woke up early, still feeling like something inside me had shifted. It was as if writing had brushed off a thick layer of dust from my soul. I got up slowly, drank a lukewarm cup of coffee, and walked down the hallway to a door that had remained closed since the night it all happened. Michael's room. I stopped in front of it, took a deep breath, turned the doorknob. The smell was the same. A mix of youthful cologne, old books, and something only mothers can name. The sheets were still folded, his sneakers lined up, and on the desk, an open notebook with a capped pen resting on the last line he had written. I ran my fingers across the page, as if trying to feel the weight of his handwriting. The window was still shut, and the air was heavy. In there, time had stopped. And for the first time, I realized that keeping it that way might have been my way of not losing myself completely. I sat on the edge of the bed, picked up one of my son's t-shirts and pressed it to my chest. I cried softly. Not the loud, desperate sobbing of those early days. It was a quiet lament, like the creak of an old door that refuses to open. I thought about the letter from the night before, thought about the woman who had written it, thought about her son, Ethan. I hadn't heard that name again without feeling thorns, but now the name surfaced wrapped in fog, blurry, full of questions. Who was that boy now? What did he say about that night? I didn't know, but I wanted to. I stood up, took a deep breath, and opened the window. Light flooded the room. My eyes stung, but I didn't pull away. For the first time in months, I allowed the light to touch that space. It wasn't much, but it was something. I went back to the living room and picked up pen and paper, sat again at the kitchen table and began writing my second letter. It wasn't accusatory anymore. It was curious. I wanted to understand. I wanted to hear. I wanted, though I wouldn't admit it, to talk. When I finished, I signed only with my name, Diane. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was openness. And that, for a grieving heart, was the first step toward breathing again. The next letter took longer to arrive. When it finally did, it didn't come under the door. It was handed to me quietly by Walter, the town's longtime mailman, who'd known me since Michael was little. Mrs. Diane? This came with a note. It's personal, he said, handing me the envelope carefully, as if he too felt the weight of unspoken words. I nodded and went back inside without a word. The handwriting, once again, was from a woman. But there was something different about that envelope, a certain shakiness in the letters, as if it had been written in a rush or with trembling hands. When I opened it, I found not just a letter, but also a folded sheet with a short message written in blue ink and hesitant strokes. It was a note. I didn't recognize the handwriting. It was signed only with an E. The letter, from Karen, began with an apology for taking so long. She said the words weren't coming easily, and that her house was now made of silence. Ethan barely left his room. He rarely spoke, refused to see friends, didn't care about school or therapy or conversation. He's someone else now, she wrote, and sometimes I feel like I am too. The note attached was from Ethan. It was brief, almost a shadow. It said, "She still cries because of me. I don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry." I read and reread that note until my eyes burned. It was the first time I'd seen anything written by the other boy, and what I found there wasn't cruelty or arrogance. It was pain, raw pain, hidden in a few short words. And somehow, that disarmed me more than any explanation could have. I sat at the same table where I'd written all the other letters, stared at the paper for a long time, then picked up a fresh sheet and wrote just a few lines. I still cry too, but not out of hatred. I cry for everything left between us. Write again if you want, or just read. Knowing that you feel something, that's more than I expected. This time, I folded the letter more carefully, slipped it into the envelope like I was protecting something fragile, and walked, slowly, as if I were carrying not a letter, but a first gesture of peace. Linda showed up unannounced, rang the bell once and waited with her arms crossed, the way she used to do when we were teenagers and she refused to ask permission. I opened the door slowly, surprised by the visit. My sister's face was tense, and her eyes held a mix of worry and judgment. "Can we talk?" she asked, bluntly. I nodded and stepped aside. We went to the living room. The coffee in the thermos was already cold, but I served it anyway. Between sisters, not everything has to be warm to make sense. Linda got straight to the point. She knew about the letters. Someone in the neighborhood had mentioned it, and the news had spread with the speed of whispered words. "Are you really writing to that woman?" she asked, unable to hide her shock. I didn't answer right away. I added sugar to my coffee, stirred it slowly, and only then looked up. "I'm trying to understand what's left of all this." My answer threw her off. She leaned back in the chair, clearly uncomfortable. The silence that followed was old. It carried not just the grief of losing Michael, but all the silences we had stored up over the years. Linda and I had never been especially close. We'd moved through life at different paces. She was always firm, rational, practical. I was more contemplative, sensitive to what wasn't said. In our grief, we drifted even farther apart, not because of a fight, but because we didn't know how to reach each other's pain. And now, here we were, forced to face what had grown between us. Linda spoke again, her tone softer now. She said she understood my pain, but reopening wounds like this was dangerous. "That woman, isn't she to blame?" she asked, almost like a challenge. I took a deep breath. "She's in pain, and that's enough." The words came out clear, like a clean cut. Linda didn't push further, but she looked at me with a mix of surprise and something like admiration. She didn't recognize me. But maybe, for the first time, she was ready to truly get to know me. What followed was a heavy silence, but not empty. It was a space finally filled with something that didn't need to be spoken. I looked out the window. The sky was starting to change color, and inside me, something also felt like it was shifting. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was the recognition that there were still possible paths between us. Linda then walked over to the bookshelf, picked up a framed photo of us as girls. She smiled faintly. "Remember that trip? When we got lost on the trail and you started crying?" I cried too, but I didn't tell anyone. I smiled gently. I always knew. That small exchange of memories was all we had to begin stitching together what time had torn. Before leaving, Linda paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and said something that sounded more like a confession than advice. "When my son got sick, I thought I was going to die. But you actually died. And now I think maybe you're coming back." I didn't answer. I just nodded with my eyes. The door closed in silence. That night, I wrote another letter, but not to Karen, not to Ethan. I wrote to Linda, and when I folded the paper, I didn't put it in an envelope. I left it on the table next to the cold coffee, a symbolic gesture, as if to say, "I'm here. When you're ready, you can read it." The news made its way through town, the way all things do that were meant to stay in silence, as whispers crossing sidewalks, church pews, and pharmacy lines. No one knew exactly who had said it first, but within 2 days, the small circle of neighbors was already murmuring. Diane, Michael's mother, was exchanging letters with the mother of the other boy. Some spoke with pity, others with indignation, and there were those who simply furrowed their brows, like someone looking at a crooked painting and choosing not to get involved. At the Saturday market, I felt the stares. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But as I walked between the fruit stands, I noticed the short smiles, the eyes that quickly looked away, the muffled greetings. Mrs. Ivy, who always offered me an extra bunch of parsley, just handed me my change without looking up. A couple crossed the street when they saw me coming, and a young man I barely knew said loud enough not to be accidental. Some people forgive too easily. I came home with my bags half empty and my heart full of thorns. I didn't cry, but I couldn't breathe right for the rest of the day. I sat in the kitchen, stirring sugar into cold coffee, as if the sound of the spoon could somehow dissolve the pain. What hurt wasn't the cruelty, but the realization. The town that had comforted me in the early days now judged me for trying to understand the pain from the other side. That night, I wrote another letter to Karen. I began differently. Today, I don't write as a mother. I write as a woman being watched. I told her everything. How people's eyes followed me like I was betraying someone. How the smiles had vanished. How the loneliness, which used to be quiet, now felt like a sentence. Maybe you know that feeling better than I do, I wrote. Maybe it's always been that way for you. On the other side, Karen read the letter sitting on her back porch. It was cold, but she needed the air. She read slowly, line by line, as if each word were a small wound opened in a mirror. And then she replied. She said yes, she knew that kind of heavy silence, that losing a living son also brings grief, grief for yourself. She said there were days when she couldn't look in the mirror without seeing, in her son's eyes, the question she didn't know how to answer. Why didn't you see me? The reply came 3 days later. I wasn't expecting it. But Karen's letter had a new tone. It wasn't light, but it was intimate. And there was a part I read 5 times. Sometimes I think the real judgment never came from the town. It came from within. And maybe, because of that, we have to forgive ourselves before the world ever does. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, picked up a blanket, sat on the armchair, and let the breeze come through the cracked window. It wasn't exactly comfort, but it felt like a gentle balm over an open wound. For the first time, I thought that maybe, just maybe, writing wasn't just persistence. It was survival. It was while organizing an old box in the laundry room closet that I found the photograph. It was tucked between 2 school notebooks, inside an envelope yellowed with time. When I opened it, I immediately recognized Michael's smile. Still a little boy, messy hair, front tooth missing. Next to him, another boy smiled with the same childish joy. It was Ethan. The picture had been taken at a birthday party in the city park, years before the accident. Both boys wore colorful party hats and held goodie bags. I froze. I held the photo in both hands, trying to understand how that piece of paper had gone unnoticed for so long. Michael and Ethan together, laughing like the world was nothing more than that single moment. It was impossible to look at that image and not think of the abyss that would later separate them. And yet, in that snapshot, there was innocence. A friendship forgotten by time, buried by tragedy. I spent the rest of the day restless. Ethan's face so close to Michael's, at an age when no one is villain or martyr. I started asking myself, what happened between them after that? Why did they drift apart? When did things begin to fall apart? There was so much I didn't know. And now, all that remained were questions suspended between memory and emptiness. By late afternoon, I wrote a new letter. This time it was short, but I enclosed the photo. There was no way to ignore that symbol. I wrote only, they already knew each other. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they remembered. But for some reason, they were together that night. And somehow, that still hurts. I folded the photo carefully, placed it in the envelope, and walked to the mailbox. My steps were slow, as if each one weighed more than the last. But something about sharing that memory also brought me relief. As if dividing the weight was the only way to keep walking, the reply came quickly. Karen thanked me for the photo, said she didn't remember that day, but recognized the park and the blue shirt Ethan was wearing. She still had it, like so many other pieces she hadn't been able to let go of. She admitted that seeing the image stirred something in her, like it touched something forgotten deep inside. She wrote, "Sometimes, what breaks us the most isn't the end. It's remembering that once, before everything, there was a beginning." And they laughed. I read the sentence slowly, then looked again at the photo. I placed it on the dresser, next to the framed picture of Michael's last portrait. Two versions of the same boy. Two truths now coexisting in the same space. And there, in that quiet gesture, I realized this story never had a villain. Only people trying to survive the pain of being human. The day began cold and overcast, with that kind of gray light that seems to wash the color out of everything. I woke up early, but stayed in bed for long minutes, listening to the distant sound of birds and the kettle heating in the kitchen. I got up slowly. The weight of missing him was still there, as always, but there was something else, a quiet urgency. I reached under the bed and pulled out an old box, took out a blue-covered notebook, still untouched. I decided it was time to start writing everything that no longer fit in the letters I exchanged with Karen. I opened to the first page and without thinking too much wrote, "To Michael." Black ink on white paper felt more final than any gravestone. I started slowly, writing about the days, about the bitter coffee I still insisted on making, about the longing I no longer knew how to name. With each sentence, I felt like I was stitching a gap inside myself. I wasn't writing to heal, I was writing not to explode. By late morning, I sat in my son's room, left the notebook on the bed, and ran my fingers across the shelves, touching the books he'd never finish. That was where I would now write, every night. The letters that would never be sent. The confessions no one else would hear. The silence, somehow, felt smaller when filled with words. In the next letter to Karen, I told her about the notebook, said I was writing to Michael like someone whispering into their own chest. "I don't expect a reply," I wrote, "but I feel like he hears me." I also wrote about the dreams. Sometimes I saw his face in visions so vivid that I'd wake up with his scent still on my skin. And then I admitted something I'd only now found the courage to say. "For the first time, I'm afraid of stopping feeling," Karen replied gently. She said she also wrote, but on loose papers, kept in a shoebox. Said Ethan hardly left his room, but sometimes she'd catch him staring out the window, eyes fixed on nothing, like someone looking for something they'd lost inside themselves. "I wish I knew how to help," she wrote, "but sometimes I think he doesn't want to be helped. He just wants not to be forgotten." I read that sentence more than once. It said so much. Michael was gone, and yet so present. Ethan was alive, and yet so far away. It was strange to think that both boys, in different ways, were trapped in places no one could reach. That night, I went back to the notebook. I wrote about the day Michael learned to ride a bike, about the fall he took and how he looked at me, expecting applause instead of rescue. I cried while writing, but not with despair, with tenderness. Because in that moment, I realized I was starting to remember my son not just through absence, but through life. And there, between the filled pages and the silent tears, I discovered a new way to keep going. By telling. Because when words become shelter, even pain finds a place to rest. That morning, the letter arrived heavier. The envelope was thick, with a bent corner, as if it had been sealed in a hurry. I recognized Karen's handwriting before I even opened it. I sat with the envelope on the kitchen table, staring at it for long minutes, as if delaying what I already knew. There was something in there that would change everything. When I finally tore the edge of the envelope, 2 papers fell onto the tablecloth. One was the letter. The other, a handwritten note. Firm letters, but full of hesitation. I read the note first, and with each word, I felt the ground slipping from under my feet. "Mom, it was my idea. The car was yours, but I took the key. I was the one who insisted. Michael didn't want to. He hesitated, but I asked. I said it would be quick, that no one would know. We switched places at the last minute. He trusted me. I'm sorry." The note was from Ethan. I braced both hands on the table and closed my eyes. The room slowly spun, as if everything around me had lost its balance. That confession, raw and unexpected, brought a new kind of pain. Because for the first time, I saw the outline of Michael's choice, his hesitation, his trust. And somehow, that hurt more than the tragedy itself, because now there was context, a decision, a consequence. Karen's letter accompanied the note, filled with painful explanations. She said she'd found the paper inside one of her son's books, on a shelf he rarely touched. She didn't know how long it had been there. She'd read it over and over again, heartbroken, until she found the courage to send it to me. "I thought you needed to know," she wrote, "even if it breaks us more." I didn't cry right away. I got up, picked up the blue notebook, and walked to Michael's room. I sat on his bed, opened a blank page, and just stared at it. The pen took time to touch the paper, but when it did, it came with force. "My son, you said yes, and now I carry that yes like a stone inside my chest. You trusted, you hesitated, and still, you went. Why? For friendship? For fear of saying no? To seem strong? I would give anything to go back and hold your hand, to tell you that you could say no, that sometimes real courage means staying."
When I finished, I closed the notebook and stayed in silence. The room stood still, as if time had stopped with Michael's last breath. But inside me, everything was moving. A storm of memories, anger, tenderness, and longing. For the first time, I felt at war with my own love. By the end of the day, I replied to Karen. I only wrote, "Thank you for giving me this truth. It hurts, but it gives me something to hold on to, and that's already more than the emptiness." Then I went for a walk. The wind hit my face cold. The trees whispered things only those who've lost can understand. And I walked slowly, with steady steps and wet eyes, like someone who knows that some truths don't free us, but still push us, even if stumbling, back toward life. The doorbell rang quietly, almost timidly, as if asking permission to break the silence. I was in the kitchen, folding old dish towels I didn't even use anymore, when I heard it. I opened the door with the neutral expectation of someone who's not expecting anyone. But there she was, Karen, standing there, holding her purse tightly, eyes full of tears. "I know it's unexpected," she said. I didn't answer. I just opened the door wider and stepped aside so she could come in. The meeting that had only existed through letters now shared the same space. 2 women, different in so many ways, united by a tragedy that had shaken us to the core. We sat at the kitchen table, where so many letters had been written. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was the silence of those who had already said everything on paper, but still needed to recognize each other in person. Karen pulled something from her bag, Ethan's note, now inside a clear envelope.
"He doesn't know I brought it, but I needed you to see it again, through my eyes." I looked at the paper. It was the same, but in that moment, it looked different. more human, more tragic, closer. We didn't talk much. We exchanged more glances than words. Karen spoke about Ethan's room, where bright lights coexisted with heavy silence. She told me he'd been drawing obsessively, repeated sketches of wheels, roads, curves, always curves. I told her about the blue notebook, about the dreams of Michael, about the fear of forgetting the sound of his voice. At some point, the tears came, first hers, then mine. They weren't desperate tears, but exhausted ones, from two people carrying the weight of something that never goes away. And there, in that shared weeping, something dissolved. Not the grief, not the pain, but the solitary guilt we both had carried. When Karen stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Do you think he hates me?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Then, in a quiet voice, I said, "I think he's still looking for you, even if he doesn't know it." We hugged. A hug without relief, without promises, but real, hard and necessary, like two people recognizing the same kind of pain in each other. When I closed the door, I rested my forehead against the wood, took a deep breath, and realized the house was silent. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a new one, a silence that was finally starting to feel lived in. 2 days after the visit, I opened Michael's closet to reorganize the clothes that still hung there, as a way of keeping him close. I had thought about donating them, boxing them up, removing everything from sight. But I never had the courage. It was as if, by touching each piece, I could still feel something of him. A forgotten memory in a pocket, a scent of time. That's when, moving a pile of jackets, I found a small shoebox, sealed with tape, and pushed to the back of the shelf. My heart sped up for no clear reason. I sat on the floor with the box in my lap and carefully removed the lid. Inside, there was a collection of little objects, notes from friends, movie tickets, a festival wristband, a cutout photo from a notebook, a rusty keychain, and a piece of cloth with something scribbled in black pen. Everything passes, except what stays. I recognized my son's handwriting. Those words felt like they had been written for me, or maybe by me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't just a box of keepsakes. It was a wordless diary, a quiet portrait of everything he had chosen to hold on to. And among the items, there was one note that made me hold my breath. A folded piece of paper with just one sentence. "Ethan is sadder than he looks. Sometimes he just wants to disappear." My hand trembled. It had been written by Michael. It wasn't judgment. It was observation, a subtle kindness, a warning no one had heard in time. I sat there, holding the paper, feeling that more than answers, I was finding new questions, and with them, a deeper connection between the two boys. Later, I wrote to Karen. I told her I had found the box, that I now knew a little more about the son who had left, and about the one who stayed. I shared the note, the simple words, the silent pain behind a brief sentence. "They saw each other more than we ever realized," I wrote. "And maybe that's why it all hurt so much." Karen replied that same day. She told me that earlier that week, Ethan had left one of his drawings on the table, a winding curve with two boys holding hands, standing in the middle of the road. No faces, no end. She said she didn't ask anything, just kept the drawing like a prayer. I read her reply, picked up the box again, and placed it on the desk. That's where it would stay, beside the blue notebook. Two different ways of holding on to love, and for the first time, I felt like maybe there was a path, not to forget, not to erase, but to keep going. Because deep down, that's what memory asks, that someone stays, even after the end. The next morning, I put on my shoes without much thought. I grabbed a light jacket, left the house, and began walking with no clear destination. The air was damp, and the sidewalks were scattered with wet leaves. There was something about the sound of my footsteps mixed with the breeze that brought me a strange kind of peace, as if I had finally found a way to move without carrying the full weight. I passed by the park where Michael used to play. I saw the same bench where he'd eat popcorn with me, the swings where he pushed his friends. I remembered an afternoon when he fell and cried for just a second, then looked at me and said, "It was nothing, Mom. I just slipped on the wind." I smiled at the memory. That was so Michael. So him. Then I walked past the bakery he liked. The same attendant was still there. I almost went in, but instead just stood outside. I pictured my son inside, ordering his usual sweet bread. It felt like seeing a ghost that didn't scare, only brought longing. Finally, I stopped in front of the wall where he and his friends used to draw with chalk. The wall still held faded marks, ghosts of old laughter. One of them, half hidden, was a name in big letters, Michael plus Ethan. No heart, no arrows, just the names. I ran my fingers over the letters. It was as if that wall held a piece of what I needed to remember, that they were friends, before everything, before the tragedy, before the pain. I sat on the curb for a few minutes. I watched kids playing across the street, laughter, bouncing balls, bikes tracing lines on the pavement. There was life, and I was there, in between memory and hope. After the walk, back at home, I sat with the blue notebook and wrote one of the longest entries yet. I wrote about the wall, about the fallen leaves, about the longing that now came more gently, like a caress rather than a wound. I wrote about how strange it felt to walk alone through places that once belonged to the two of us and still feel his presence beside me. I ended with a short sentence. Today, I walked with you, my son, and for the first time, my steps weren't only pain. 2 weeks later, I decided it was time to give something back. The pain no longer blinded me. It was still there, but now it mixed with a kind of tenderness. I took the old photo of the boys at the birthday party, placed it in an envelope along with a copy of Michael's note, and wrote a new letter to Karen. I said that it wasn't a gift or a goodbye. It was simply a bond, a bridge built over the wreckage. We don't have to carry it all alone anymore, I wrote. What used to be just pain is now also memory, and shared memory can be a kind of relief. The same day Karen received it, she called me. It was the first time we'd ever spoken by voice. The call began in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if our breathing sought the same rhythm. When we spoke, it felt like we were continuing the last letter. No formality, no mask. We talked for an hour about our sons, our losses, faith, guilt, routine. We laughed quietly, as if asking sadness for permission. We cried too, but gently, like people rinsing their souls without drowning in them. At the end, we made a simple, almost symbolic plan. One day, we would visit the place where it all happened. No expectations, no promises, just to be there, and to remember that despite everything, we were still alive. It was a simple road, with no sharp turns, no important signs, just a dusty crossing flanked by bushes. But for Karen and me, that spot in town was an invisible landmark. That ground held more than footprints. It held the last moment our sons were together. It was the place where everything changed, and until then, neither of us had the courage to visit it. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted in tones of copper and orange. We got out of the car slowly, in silence, each of us breathing heavily and trembling slightly. The wind blew gently, as if it had learned to respect sorrow. There was no sound, no people around, only the rustling of leaves, quiet breathing, and tear-filled eyes. I walked a few steps ahead. My feet touched that ground slowly, the one I had seen only in my memories for so long. Karen came close in silence and handed me a small folded note. Inside was a handwritten phrase. They were good, and they were ours. I held those words with the care you give to something sacred. I pulled out 2 flowers from my bag, one white and one blue, and laid them on a large stone by the roadside. It was our gesture of surrender, not of forgetting, but of acceptance, as if telling the heavens, they existed, they changed us, and now we want to change this pain too. We stayed there a long time. Neither of us tried to speak. We didn't need to. What had to be said was already in our gestures, in the hands that touched without shame, in the look that said, I understand, even if I can never explain. When we hugged, it wasn't because of pain. It was for the love that resisted what pain tried to erase. We returned home with lighter hearts, as if something had been left behind, surrendered to the road itself. And deep down, we knew part of us would always remain there. But for the first time, that no longer stopped us from moving forward. That night, I sat again before the blue notebook. My hands no longer trembled. The silence around me felt welcoming, not oppressive. The blank page invited me to one final act of love. I wrote slowly, like someone caressing a memory. My son, I miss you every day. But now I know I can live with that absence. It is part of me, just like you. Love doesn't disappear, it only changes form. Today, I see the world with your eyes. I breathe with your courage, and I carry your name inside me. I closed the notebook gently, tied it with a light blue ribbon, like someone wrapping up a story and placing it in a safe place. It wasn't forgetting. It was honor. It was the recognition that not every presence needs a voice, that some presences live in memory and help us walk in silence. I placed the notebook on the shelf among his favorite books. I smiled softly, because at that moment, I knew the story wasn't ending. It was only changing tone and place. And from then on, I didn't need to write to feel alive. I already was, and ready to remember, with more love than pain. It happened on a clear morning. The sun came through the slats of the window with a soft light, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. I was watering the plants on the porch when I heard the doorbell. It was a familiar sound, but in that moment, it carried a deeper meaning. When I opened the door, there they were, Karen and Ethan. He was taller, thinner, his shoulders slightly hunched, but his eyes held something new. There was a timid glow, almost hidden, like he too was trying to relearn how to live. He reached out to me and simply said, "Hi." That was enough. I invited them in. We sat in the living room, the 3 of us, silent for a few minutes. Then we started talking. About simple things at first. The weather, Ethan's drawings, a book Karen was reading. It was strange and, at the same time, natural, as if that meeting had long been set. At one point, I stood and went to the bookshelf. I took the copy of the birthday photo, the one I had once sent to Karen, and handed it to Ethan. "Do you remember this?" I asked. He nodded with teary eyes. "We laughed a lot," he said. And then, for the first time, I saw not only the boy who stayed, but also the boy who left. They were both there, together, in that image. And for a moment, I felt like the guardian of both, guardian of a memory that was now shared. We stayed there longer than I expected. Karen helped me set the table. Ethan quietly sketched in a notebook for a few minutes. When they left, we hugged, and I knew something had been mended, not healed, but touched, with care, with truth. I closed the door and leaned against it, closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and felt clearly that what began with a letter now ended with a gesture of life. Time passed, the letters stopped, but the connection remained. Karen and I met from time to time. We had coffee, shared comfortable silences, spoke of our sons with less pain and more light. It wasn't forgetting, it was learning to carry. Ethan began studying art. One of his drawings was exhibited at school. Two shadowy figures holding hands, sketched in graphite, over a winding road. I looked at that image for a long time. It was like seeing Michael there, unseen but present, as if that extended hand on paper was also holding mine. I tended the garden. I read a lot. Sometimes I still dreamed of Michael. Sometimes I wrote little notes and left them inside books, like someone sewing longing with care. Longing was now part of me, like a scar that doesn't hurt, but pulses when the wind changes. One autumn afternoon, I found an envelope in the mailbox with no name. Inside, a blank sheet. But in the bottom right corner, in small, familiar handwriting, were the words, "Everything passes, except what stays." I smiled, closed my eyes, and for a moment, I felt that Michael and Ethan were still there, one in time, the other in life. And I, between the two, as someone who understands that some pains don't heal, but transform into love that stays. And it's that love that remains. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night with a need to write, but I no longer reach for the blue notebook, not because the pain is gone, but because it has learned to live quietly inside me. I write on loose sheets, tucked between books, or scribbled on the backs of bills, old recipes. They're notes to myself, or maybe to him. I never quite know. My garden bloomed, the roses finally thrived, and the daisies Michael loved grew again near the fence. Every time I see one bloom, I remember his laughter running through the garden, trying to catch butterflies with his hands. He never caught any, but he laughed like he had won the world. Ethan started visiting me sometimes, always shy, always kind. One day he brought me a drawing as a gift. Two women sitting side by side, each holding an envelope. No faces, no color, just delicate, firm lines. It was enough. I kept that drawing along with Karen's last letter, not out of attachment, but gratitude. Because I know some stories don't end with a period. They keep living in every gesture we offer the world after we've been touched by grief. Today, when someone asks me if I've moved on, I smile. Because I know that question only exists for those who've never lost. What I lived through can't be moved on from. It transforms into memory, into flower, into word, into love. And in the letters that remain, even without an address, my son keeps living. And I keep living with him.